Well, it's good to be with all of you here at End Times with Pastor Eric. Today we have a very important topic. That is, we're going to try to understand the day of the Lord. This is part 2. And in particular, we're going to be answering the question, are there signs before the day of the Lord? Now, this is very important because if you don't understand the relationship between the broad day of the Lord and the narrow, and the fact that there aren't any signs prior to the broad day of the Lord, I think you'll always be out in left field regarding eschatology. And so please bear with me. Please pay attention to the details of this message because you will understand how the day of the Lord functions and why there are no signs prior to the broad day of the Lord. Okay, so let's begin straight away. We've got a lot to cover here in the 7 slides that I have for you. Let's begin by talking about, again, what the day of the Lord is. I defined for you last time 3 things regarding the day of the Lord. The first is the day of the Lord is a broad period of time in the future in which God will finally and forever save his people and judge his enemies. Remember, I mentioned last time that regarding the broad day of the Lord, it starts at the parousia. The broad day of the Lord begins here. It is a signless event. We know that the broad day of the Lord begins like a thief at the beginning of the parousia, the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel, and it extends all the way through eternity. Now, how do we know that? Remember, the Apostle Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3 says that the day of the Lord comes like a thief. That's what he's talking about, the beginning of it. But then he talks about the destruction of the heavens and the earth. Well, that happens over 1,000 years later. Okay, right here, where then you have the new heavens, the new earth, the new Jerusalem in the eternal states. And so for Peter, the day of the Lord, the broad day of the Lord, is a broad period of time. Okay? Now, second, I mentioned, whoops, I got rid of my pointer there. Sorry about that. Number 2, we said that the day of the Lord can be broken down into both a broad day and a narrow day. What I'm going to be showing you today is that the broad day of the Lord begins at the beginning of the parousia, but there's a narrow day called the great and terrible day of the Lord, according to Joel 2:31 and Malachi 4:5, which occurs at the end of the 70th week of Daniel, the end of the parousia, and that is the battle, the unique 24-hour day in which the Messiah will battle the enemies that surround Jerusalem and then establish his millennial kingdom after he wipes them out. Okay? That's the narrow day of the Lord, and I'll be making a case for that. All right? So there's a distinction between the broad day of the Lord that becomes like a thief, there's no signs prior to it, and it extends unto eternity. But there are signs, as I will show you, that come prior to the narrow day of the Lord, the 24-hour day in which Jesus destroys his enemies as he returns and places his feet on the Mount of Olives and sets up his kingdom. Okay? So that leads me to number 3. There are no precursors prior to the broad day of the Lord that begins at the inception of the 70th week of Daniel, or the parousia. But there are precursors or signs that occur prior to the narrow day of the Lord, that 24-hour period. That's my central thesis. Okay? So let me unpack this for you. The question, are there signs before the great and terrible day of the Lord, that's the narrow day, and are there signs before the broad day of the Lord? Well, here's my thesis. There are no signs prior to the parousia. So during the church age, as you and I live, there are no signs to tip us off as to when this parousia will come. That's a technical term for the coming of Christ. It begins with the rapture. According to 1 Thessalonians 4:15 through 17, we're going to be raptured at the beginning of the parousia. Okay, look it up yourself. The term parousia is used in 1 Thessalonians 4:15, so it's connected to the harpazo, the snatching up or the rapture of the church. Okay, so there are no signs prior to that. That's why it comes like a thief. Jesus says that in Matthew 24:37. Paul says that the day of the Lord comes like a thief. 1 Thessalonians 5:2. Why? Because there are no signs in the church age as to when this time period begins. Okay, however, let me put, actually I've got a little diagram here for you. Notice there's no signs during the church age. Okay, but there are signs inside the parousia. So all the signs that you'll see are inside the 70th week of Daniel, not prior to it, but inside, that will tip you off as to when the narrow day comes. Again, the broad day begins at the beginning of the parousia and extends into eternity. The narrow day, called the great and terrible day of Yahweh, there are signs prior to it, but not prior to the broad day. Okay, that's the thesis I'm going to be defending here today, and I'll show you, I think, why it's biblical. Okay, so what we have to do is we have to wrestle with two primary texts that seem to indicate that there are signs prior to the day of the Lord. That's Malachi 4:5 and 2 Thessalonians 2:1-3. For the sake of time, I'm just going to handle Malachi 4:5. We'll handle 2 Thessalonians 2:1-3 next time. Okay? These two texts seem to indicate that there are precursors prior to the day of the Lord. What I'll be showing you is that in both texts, the signs that they give are inside the parousia prior to the narrow day, but they don't come before the broad day. Okay? In other words, the signs are all inside the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, so that's the thesis I'll be proving here today. So let's begin, though, by looking at the context of Malachi 4:5. And remember, back in Malachi chapter 3, you had the sending of this messenger. It's really the Lord himself will come suddenly to his temple. Well, I think that refers to his first coming. Well, when you get to Malachi 4, the discussion begins about the day of the Lord. And it's just broadly the day of the Lord at the beginning of Malachi 4. And we see that in the opening 3 verses. Notice here Malachi says, "For behold, the day is coming, burning like a furnace, and all the arrogant and every evildoer will be chaff. And the day that is coming will set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings, and you will go forth and skip about like calves from the stall. You will tread down the wicked, for they will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day which I am preparing, says the Lord of hosts." Now, dear ones, first of all, how do we know that this is the day of the Lord? Well, because it says the day is coming. Okay, oftentimes the day of the Lord is abbreviated as that day or the day. And notice we see the description of the day of the Lord. It's burning like a furnace. And notice it's not some of the arrogant in Israel or some of the arrogant in the nations. It's all of the arrogant. And every evildoer will be judged. That's the future day of the Lord. So when I say that the broad day of the Lord is the time period in which God will finally and forever save his people and finally and forever judge his enemies, I mean it. That's the best definition of the day of the Lord. Why? Because as soon as the rapture happens, we as the people of God are forever secure. We never have to worry. We're always with the Lord. In fact, Paul says, "Therefore comfort one another with these words," in 1 Thessalonians 4 after the rapture. But for the enemies of God, they'll incur the wrath in the 70th week if they're alive then. But eventually they're going to be sentenced to the lake of fire. And how long are they going to be in the lake of fire? Forever. Forever. That's why the day of the Lord is a broad period of time. It goes on forever. But for us who are saved forever, it's also a broad period of time. And I want you to see the distinction in the day of the Lord between the believer and the unbeliever. Notice for the unbeliever, it says they will be like chaff. The day that will come upon them will set them ablaze, etc. They'll have nothing left. There's going to be neither root nor branch. But notice the distinction. Now it comes to the believer. Notice he says, "But for you who fear my name." So this is every believer, whether you're Jew or Gentile. If you come to faith in Jesus Christ, this is what's going to be true for you in this future day of the Lord. It will be like the Son of Righteousness that will rise with healing in its wings. Stop there. What in the world is that metaphor that you have the Son of Righteousness that's rising with healing in its wings? What it's alluding to is this new day that's going to dawn when the Messiah rules and reigns. When the Messiah, the greater David, rules and reigns over the earth, there's going to be a great healing, of course. There's going to be resurrection for the people of God. Now, this metaphor where it says the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings, it takes you back to 2 Samuel 23, verses 2-3, where the original David, remember King David, who's in the direct lineage of the greater David, the Messiah, he was ruling and reigning from Jerusalem. Remember, he had kicked the Jebusites out. And it says this, it says literally, this is 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 4, that David's rule was as the light of the morning when the sun rises. So notice the lesser David, the king of David over Israel around 1000 BC, when he ruled and reigned, it was like a beautiful sun that had risen upon the earth. And in fact, it goes on to say, like when the tender grass springs out of the earth. It was beautiful. Why? Because there was true righteousness reigning from Jerusalem. But it's going to be even greater when the ultimate David, the Messiah, comes and reigns. Then we're going to have healing in its wings. Now, the healing here is referring to the resurrection. Now, notice the description of the resurrection that will occur. It says, you will go forth and skip about like calves from the stall. And you might say to yourself, what in the world does that have to do with resurrection? It's actually a beautiful metaphor. Listen carefully. I'm not a farmer. For those of you that are, God bless you, you understand this. But for those of you that don't understand anything about animals and calves and cows, look it up on YouTube. Okay, just pick up a new calf, baby cow, or however you want to put it, learns to walk or frolics about. When they first learn that they've got legs that work, oh, they are so excited. They are fired up. They are frolicking all about, jumping around. That's the way the scriptures say you and I are going to be when we're in our resurrected bodies. We're going to be like, can you imagine? Do you remember how slow I was in my old life? I could hardly get on my own way. I could time my 100-meter dash with a sundial. But now look at me. Or, remember I had cancer, but now that's healed. And I've got a bad knee. I hurt my knee really bad some years ago. That'll be gone. Or some of you have eye problems or ear problems or stomach problems or whatever it may be. It's all going to be gone. You're going to be in the resurrected, glorified body that Jesus Christ will give you. And you're going to be frolicking about like this calf that's saying, this is great. There's nothing like it. I've never experienced anything like this. No more pain. My body is perfect. That's the way it's going to be. How exciting. And further evidence that this is in the resurrection is notice we're going to be reigning with Christ because all the enemies are going to be like ashes under the soles of our feet. That's exactly what Jesus promises in Revelation 2:26-27 as we rule with him over the nations with a rod of iron, a reference to Psalm 2:9. So, yeah, the day of the Lord is going to be burning on the unbeliever, the evildoer, but for those who fear the Lord's name, who are believers, it's going to be the greatest thing ever. That's the way the day of the Lord is going to be. Okay, so this is the context I wanted to show you prior to reading Malachi 4:5. Okay, now let's get to Malachi 4:5 here. Let me forward the slide and let's understand it here. Malachi 4:5, it says, behold, I'm going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. Now, notice here the contention is that Elijah is going to be sent before, so this happens before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Now, if the day of the Lord that's being referred to starts here, I would have to admit there is a precursor that happens prior to the parousia. However, the way I'm going to define the great and terrible day of the Lord is that, in fact, it's a reference to this day, the narrow day, the 24-hour period in which the Messiah comes to return to destroy all of the enemies surrounding Jerusalem. Now, you might ask, hey, Eric, isn't that just special pleading? I don't think so. Now, let me explain why. The term great, which is gadol, and terrible, yareh, when you connect gadol and yareh to the day of the Lord, that phrase only occurs one other time in the entire Old Testament. And that is found in Joel 2:31. And again, remember, I think Joel wrote in the 9th century. You have Malachi writing in the 5th century. Okay, so Malachi is borrowing the great and terrible day of the Lord from Joel. Notice Joel said in Joel 2:31, the sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood. Notice, before the great and awesome day of the Lord. Now here, our New American Standard Bible, same one that I cited here, renders terrible as awesome, but it's the same term in the Hebrew. The term in Hebrew here, yareh, is the same as here, yareh. Great gadol, great gadol. And then, of course, the day of the Lord, the day of Yahweh, is the same. So these are identical phrases in the Hebrew, and they're the only two times those phrases occur in the entirety of the Old Testament. So what I believe Malachi is referring to is the same thing that Joel is referring to. Now, why is that important? Let's focus on Joel for a moment. Remember last time when I talked about Joel 2:31 segues into Joel chapter 3, where you have this final battle of the nations being brought down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, which happens on that 24-hour day, the narrow day of the Lord, in which the Messiah intervenes to destroy his enemies and to set up his kingdom in Jerusalem. That is the same battle alluded to in Zechariah 14, verses 1 through 15, where the Messiah, remember, he sets his foot on the Mount of Olives, and half the Mount of Olives will split, and half the mountain will go to the north and the other half to the south, and Jesus Christ will destroy his enemies. That's the same battle in Joel chapter 3. It's the same battle alluded to in Revelation 19:11 through 21. It's the same one. Now, here's another thing I want you to see. So this is the great and terrible day of Yahweh. It's the 24-hour period. It's not the broad day of the Lord. It's the narrow day of the Lord. Okay? So just bear with me. Let me back up. What I'm claiming is that there's an Elijah-like prophet who will come on the scene of history again at the midpoint of the 70th week of Daniel. According to Revelation 11, there's going to be two witnesses. One is like Moses. One is like Elijah. And he is going to be there before, not the broad day of the Lord, not here, but before the narrow day of the Lord, that 24-hour period. Remember, the broad day of the Lord starts at the beginning of the parousia and extends forever. The narrow day of the Lord, or the great and terrible day of the Lord, is referring to this 24-hour period, which is unique. In fact, Zechariah calls it a unique day, in which the Messiah, God himself, personally intervenes and destroys the enemies surrounding Jerusalem. Okay, now, further evidence that we are on the right track with this interpretation, let me show you Matthew 24:29. This is at the end of the 70th week of Daniel. It's at this point. Notice Jesus says, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. Stop there. If you don't understand what Jesus means by the tribulation of those days, you'll always be out in left field when it comes to eschatology. Let me explain. First of all, Jesus says immediately, not sometime after, but immediately. So this is going to happen immediately. Okay? After what? The tribulation of those days. The tribulation of those days is not the church age. That's the common error that so many evangelicals make. They think, well, the tribulation of those days, that's the church age. It is not. Listen carefully. I've alluded to this before. I'm going to have whole messages just on how to understand and interpret the Olivet Discourse. Remember, Jesus says in Matthew 24:15, so when you see the abomination that causes desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, what is he referring to? He's referring to the event that happens at the midpoint of the last 7 years of tribulation, called the 70th week of Daniel. Okay? He's not referring to anything in the church age or what's happening now. Okay? Remember, in this time period, Jesus says in Matthew 24:21 through 22, that it's the worst tribulation such as come upon the world, nor ever will. Okay, it's the worst time period ever. And he says, unless those days not be cut short, no flesh would survive. That is in the 70th week of Daniel. That's what he's referring to. So it's immediately after the tribulation of those days. What days? The 70th week of Daniel. That what? The sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. Now stop there. What is Jesus citing here? He's citing Joel 2:31. He's citing Joel 2:31, dear ones. Why? Because Joel 2:31 segues into Joel 3, where you have the final battle at the end of the 70th week of Daniel, where the nations will be brought down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and God, remember, Jehoshaphat literally is Yahweh Shofet. Yahweh is judge. So God will enter into judgment with the nations who had attacked his people, Israel. Now, let me explain for the preterist that this cannot be what happened in 70 A.D. In 70 A.D., there was one nation, not many nations, as in Joel 3. There was one nation, Rome, that sacked Jerusalem. Okay, so it was a judgment upon Jerusalem. In Joel chapter 3, the judgment isn't upon Jerusalem, but the plural nations surrounding Jerusalem. What that means is that Joel chapter 3 and the battle that happened in 70 A.D. are not the same. Okay? I hate to, we're going to have to break it down for the preterists because apparently they're having a hard time grasping this, but that's the point. It's not the same thing. These two, as the Sesame Street song goes, they're not the same thing. Okay? You can't have the judgment of Jerusalem be the same as the salvation of Jerusalem. You can't have many nations judged and then one nation that conquers. They're not the same. Okay? So we know that this is all occurring at the end of the future 70th week of Daniel. And further evidence that in fact this is true, if you kept reading on to Matthew 24:31, Jesus talks about a great trumpet. The only place in all of the Old Testament that you have great, gadol, and shofar, the term for trumpet, is found at the end of Isaiah 27. I think it's either Isaiah 27:12 or Isaiah 27:13. It's right at the end. Well, what that's referring to is the ingathering of Israel. Okay, why is that happening? Because Jesus set up his kingdom, that's why. Okay, so all of this is telling us one thing, that this great and terrible day of Yahweh, the narrow day of the Lord, that unique 24-hour period when the Messiah comes to return to set up his kingdom, there is going to be an Elijah-like prophet that happens prior to it. And lo and behold, we see evidence that this is indeed the case, that there's an Elijah-like prophet who comes, according to Revelation chapter 11, along with a Moses-like prophet who will prophesy for the last 3.5 years. Okay, so again, my claim is this Elijah prophet does not come prior to the broad day or the beginning of the parousia, but before the narrow day, that 24-hour period, when the Messiah returns to set up his kingdom and destroy his enemies. Okay, that's the thesis, and I think this all bears it out. Okay, so I hope you're making the connections. Malachi is borrowing from Joel chapter 2:31. Therefore, the great and terrible day of Yahweh is the same battle that occurs in Joel chapter 3. Remember in Joel chapter 3, he says, in those days and at that time, that connects us to the last days. Okay, that is into the same time period that Joel is referring to in Joel 2:31. Okay, and we know Jesus is citing from Joel 2:31, and he's talking about the end of the 70th week of Daniel. We know that. Okay, so therefore we know that the great and awesome day of the Lord, again, this phrase only occurs twice in the entire Old Testament, is occurring at this time period, the very end of the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, now let's ask ourselves the question, does Elijah come twice? Now why? Well, because if you're a careful reader of the New Testament, you'll realize that John the Baptist came in the spirit of Elijah. However, I'm going to show you evidence that Elijah does come during the first advent of Christ, and he comes during the second advent. It's not one or the other, it's both and. Okay, and let me show you how we know this. Remember, Jesus was on the Mount of Transfiguration in Matthew 17. The Mount of Transfiguration is very important because it is a foreshadowing. Sorry, I just had a warning come up on my computer to uninstall something or to install some software. Jesus, his transfiguration is a foreshadowing of his parousia. Okay, the coming of Christ. That's what it is. All right. Now, what happens then, notice, again, let me just reiterate Malachi 4:5. It says, behold, I'm going to send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. I'm claiming that Elijah, the prophet, comes before the 24-hour period in which Jesus judges his enemies at the end of the 70th week. Why is that important? Because in Matthew 17:10-12, right after Jesus was transfigured, before the disciples, remember James, John, and Peter, Jesus is transfigured before them. It's a foreshadowing of his coming. It's a foreshadowing, a down payment of his parousia. And who is up on the mountain? Moses and Elijah. Moses and Elijah are there. And so the disciples ask this question, why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Notice what Jesus says. Verse 11, he answered and said, Elijah is coming and will restore all things. But I say to you, but I say to you that Elijah already came, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they wished. So also the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. Let me first of all explain the Greek construction that's going on here and what I think the significance of it is. The question of the disciples, doesn't Elijah come first? Where are they getting that? They're getting it from Malachi 4:5. That's where they're getting it. Of course that's where they're getting it. So they think, wait a minute, doesn't Elijah, they're not understanding the chronology of this. They don't understand the Messiah comes first to suffer. So they're all confused about chronology. So Jesus answers, and in the Greek, he uses a Greek construction called men day. Okay, if you're to transliterate that into English, it would be M-E-N, then ellipsis, dot, 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 day, D-E. And you might say, well, who cares, Eric? Mende. Listen carefully. Mende is a construction in the Greek that has to do with on the one hand, but on the other. So you could literally render this, Jesus saying, on the one hand, Elijah is coming and will restore all things. But on the other hand, Elijah has already came. Or I should say already came. Okay? And so it's not a negation of one or the other, but an affirmation of both and. Okay? So on the one hand, Elijah, you could also say it that way, on the one hand and on the other. Okay? It's both and. Elijah is coming and will, notice the will here, will restore. It's actually a future active indicative of apokathistemi, which literally means that he will cause to stand. Okay, my point in pointing out that it's in the future is this has not occurred. So Jesus is affirming that Elijah will come in the future, and that in a sense he's already come. It's both and. So the already was John the Baptist. He came in the spirit of Elijah, it says in the book of Luke. Why? He prepared the way straight for the Lord. All right? But Jesus does not deny that Elijah is coming in the future. It's not either or, it's both and. Okay? Now, why is that so important? Well, notice here in Revelation 11, this is in the middle of the 70th week of Daniel. And I'll explain why we know that. This is at the Great Tribulation period now, where the Antichrist is on the throne in Jerusalem, and he's wreaking havoc upon the world, but mainly upon Israel. He's trying to destroy them and wipe them out. And notice what happens during this time period. Revelation 11, verse 3 and verse 6. It says, and I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 260 days clothed in sackcloth. So let's stop here. Remember, you have two witnesses here. What happened on the Mount of Transfiguration in Matthew 17? How many witnesses were there, other than the disciples, to the events of Jesus' transfiguration? It was Moses and Elijah. There were two. Why? Because every fact is going to be established by two or three witnesses, as it says in Deuteronomy 19. Okay, so there's, and by the way, Moses represents the law. You have Elijah represent the prophets. So you have a witness of the law and the prophets. And then remember, the Father says, this is my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased, listen to him. All right, so anyway, so it's very rich. That's the idea here. You have two witnesses, and they're Moses and Elijah again. Notice it says they will prophesy for 1,260 days. How long is that? That's 3.5 years. The Jews used 30-day calendar months in their prophecy. It goes all the way back to Daniel 7 and Daniel chapter 9 and even Daniel chapter 11 and chapter 12. Okay, they used 30-day calendar months. So yes, this is the last 3.5 years. That's the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. Now, how do we know that these two witnesses are like Elijah and like Moses? Well, notice the description. Verse 6, it says, these have the power to shut up the sky so that rain will not fall during the days of their prophesying. Dear ones, when Elijah was in his ministry as a prophet, according to 1 Kings, he would shut the land up from rain. And he did so for 3.5 years. In fact, James points this out in James chapter 5. I'll be showing you that. So certainly one of the prophets is going to be like Elijah. But notice the other one. The other one, it says, that has the power over the waters to turn them to blood and to strike the earth with every plague as often as they desire. That's like Moses, who gave the plagues and turned the water into blood during the first Exodus. The point is, in the last 3.5 years, there's the final Exodus. Israel's finally going to be saved, and they're really going to be brought to the promised land. This time, Christ, the Messiah, is going to bring about their promised kingdom. Okay, but you're going to have a Moses and Elijah on the scene of history. And again, that's what Malachi 4:5 is prophesying. One of these two prophets is an Elijah-like prophet who comes before the last battle at the end of the 70th week. Remember, they're going to prophesy for 1,260 days. That's from the midpoint, where you have the abomination of desolation, to the end of the 70th week of Daniel. That's when I believe that happens. Okay, does that make sense? So again, Elijah would come before the great and terrible day of the Lord, the narrow day, but not before the broad day, the inception of the 70th week. Okay, so let's try to put all of this together. Let's try to do it in one fell swoop here. Again, Matthew 17, 1 through 3. Let's look at the transfiguration. Remember, Jesus is brought up on the Mount of Transfiguration. It says 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John. So you have 3 witnesses here of the disciples, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with them. Brothers and sisters, notice Jesus was transfigured before them. Why is that significant? It's the foreshadowing of his parousia. This is happening during Jesus' first advent. It is a foreshadowing of the parousia, the 70th week of Daniel, what happens at his second advent. Okay? Notice there was a Moses and Elijah like prophets that were on the scene of history at the first advent, at the transfiguration. Those same 2 will be in the last 3.5 years during the parousia, the second advent. And again, this Moses and Elijah like prophet, as we just saw, those prophets, according to Revelation 11, verse 3 through 6, are going to prophesy for the last 3.5 years. Okay? Just prior to the great and terrible day of Yahweh, that final battle that happens when the Messiah intervenes to destroy the enemy surrounding Jerusalem and to set up his kingdom that lasts for 1,000 years. Okay, that's how we should understand it. Now, interestingly enough, when James, remember James, he was actually the brother of Jesus. Remember when he wrote, oops, I'm sorry, I forgot my little diagram here. Elijah's coming, Elijah has come. Right, that's what Jesus was saying. It's not either or, it's both and. Remember, James was the brother of Jesus, and in his epistle, he's talking about, in James 5 here, he's talking about prayer and the efficacy of prayer. Notice he says, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. In other words, he was just a human being, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the earth for 3 years and 6 months. Okay, now remember, according to Revelation 11, verse 3 and verse 6, there's going to be an Elijah-like prophet that comes on the scene of history at the midpoint. And how long is he going to prophesy? According to Revelation 11, he and that Moses? Well, for 1,260 days. Well, that's 3.5 years. Well, guess what? How long did Elijah shut up the land from rain in his ministry in the Old Testament? It was for 3.5 years. Okay, so do you see, when we start making the connections, the whole Bible fits like a glove. There's going to be an Elijah-like figure with a Moses-like figure that come on the scene of history before the great and terrible day of Yahweh, that narrow day in which the Messiah will intervene. As it says in Zechariah 14:4, he'll set his feet on the Mount of Olives. Half of the mountain will move to the north, half will move to the south. That's never happened before. And he will destroy all of the nations that come up against Jerusalem. The same thing that's spoken of in Joel chapter 3, Revelation 19, 11 through 21, and Jesus alludes to it at the end of the Olivet Discourse section on the signs in Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31. Okay? Brothers and sisters, what you need to know is that there is an Elijah-like prophet who's going to come on the scene of history, but he doesn't come during the church age. Okay? He doesn't come prior to the beginning of the parousia, the beginning of the broad day of the Lord. He comes prior to this narrow day. And if you don't make those distinctions, you're always going to be out in left field. Do you know there's a song, and by the way, I like the tune. These are the, I won't sing it, I'm the worst singer of all. In fact, the abomination that causes desolation may be my singing voice. Okay? But my point is, there's a song, These Are the Days of Elijah. That's error. The days of Elijah are not during the church age in which you and I are living in. No, the days of Elijah happen in the 70th week of Daniel. See, if we start getting our eschatology right and our theology right, we all of a sudden start to see the profundity and the richness of Scripture, that it starts fitting like a glove. And then we can start saying, well, wait a minute, why does the day of the Lord come like a thief? Because when Paul's talking about the day of the Lord coming like a thief, he's talking about the broad day. There's nothing to tip you off to the broad day of the Lord. But why does it say that in fact Elijah comes before the great and terrible day of Yahweh? Because the great and terrible day of Yahweh is that unique 24-hour period that both Joel 2:31 and Malachi 4:5 allude to, the only two that allude to it, that narrow day where the Messiah intervenes to judge his enemies surrounding Jerusalem. Okay, and yes, there are signs prior to that, but not prior to the broad day of the Lord. Dear ones, all of the details in the Bible are going to be literally fulfilled. All of the details concerning the first advent of Christ were literally fulfilled. And so what I want you to see in all of this is the absolute precision and the profundity of the scriptures, and why you can know that the ensuing day of the Lord, the parousia, indeed comes like a thief. There's nothing to tip you off to it. Let's ask ourselves the question, why do so many prophecy teachers at eschatology conferences keep bringing up newspaper clippings? They'll say, well, I think this may be this and this may be this, because they don't understand that there are no signs within the church age. They keep believing that the signs Jesus is referring to in the Olivet Discourse are things that are happening in the church age. It's not true. Every single sign Jesus gives you in Matthew 24 from verse 4 all the way to verse 35 are signs that happen inside the parousia. But when that parousia will come, he starts to answer that in Matthew 24:36, and he says no one knows. In fact, in verse 37, we see it's going to be like the days of Noah. Later on in Matthew 24, he says it comes like a thief. Why does his parousia come like a thief? And according to the Apostle Paul, the day of the Lord comes like a thief? Because before the broad day of the Lord, there are no signs. There are signs, however, as we just saw today, before that unique 24-hour day, which for the only time in history, God himself, the Messiah, will intervene in a battle with the enemy surrounding Jerusalem. And I want you to think about the profundity of what that day will be like. I want you to think of how many times the poor Israelites were smitten, as it were, by the enemies of God. And I long for the day where finally the Messiah intervenes and says, that's it, no more. I won't take it anymore. Why is it important? Because the desire to wipe out Israel is a desire to make our God a liar. It says in Romans 11:26, all Israel will be saved. Oh, Satan would love to make God a liar, but he's not. He's not. And the final opportunity happens when there's this showdown. There's going to be a new sheriff in town, and it's the Lord Jesus Christ, and he's going to destroy his enemies, and he's going to bring to us the great kingdom that we've been longing for, in which he will rule and reign upon the earth. And before that unique 24-hour day, it says that this Elijah-like figure will be on the scene of history for 3.5 years. That's what the scriptures are telling you. No signs before the broad day of the Lord, but we do have Elijah before the unique 24-hour great and terrible day of the Lord. Brothers and sisters, look at the data yourself. I know I threw a lot at you, but examine these things for yourself. By the way, another great resource, a man who saw these things very clearly, is a man who just died not too long ago, a man named Reynolds Showers. And I believe he has a book about the day of the Lord. I think he has a very good take on the broad day and the narrow day of the Lord. There's other men who saw the same thing. Robert Thomas, who taught at Master's Seminary. There's a John Hart who taught at Moody Institute. These men see these things. And my issue is that too many pastors and too many scholars aren't making these connections. We need to make them, because the Bible is precise. The Bible is profound. Brothers and sisters, next time we're together, I'll be showing you that 2 Thessalonians 2 does not give you also any precursors prior to the broad day of the Lord. And I'll be laying that out. It's very complex. Bring your thinking cap, but we're going to handle the issue. Does 2 Thessalonians 2 verses 1 through 3, does it teach that there are precursors prior to the broad day of the Lord? The answer, as you will find out, is no. God bless all of you. Keep studying the scriptures. We'll see you next time.